So in another time and place, I studied Russian olive in riparian landscapes. But lately, in the last decade, I've been studying grassland revegetation in like a recreational context. So what you're looking at right here is the southern reservoir valley of the Garden of the Gods, where there used to be a trail running right through this valley. And when I was getting my PhD, I worked with the Rocky Mountain Field Institute and I worked on revegetation projects. But I became so fascinated with the idea of like dry land revegetation without supplemental water that I continued to monitor and analyze the trails that we closed in 2016 for like 5 or 6 years afterwards. And so right here where this piece of wood is like was the start of a trail. We spread a 10 species reclamation mix that the city of Colorado Springs uses that actually I was consulted on a long time ago. Great species, all natives. And their only problem with the reclamation mix is there's no forbs, right? So one of the conclusions after my work here is that we need to get some forbs in there to really restore a successful habitat. Before I get off this slide, I'll also tell you like I can still see the trail, but maybe not everyone can. And that's because the species that are in the trail are different than the reference species. So another concluding comment, just laying it out there right at the beginning, is if you really want a trail to disappear, you need to collect the seed from the referent community nearby. Otherwise, your trail will likely be hyper diverse or alternately diverse than the space right nearby. And the way that you can really see this is in the fall because the grasses senesce to different colors. All right, so today we're going to talk about the ecology of grasslands. We're going to look at some common species and we're going to learn some work. I've tried to like digest the first couplets in the Poaceae key because it's not that hard to get all the way to like the seventh or eighth choice and figure out the family keys. So without further ado, we all live here, so you understand what the landscape is like. We have so much diversity in our plant communities because of our great diversity and elevation. And our grasslands are really typified in the plains and foothills ecosystems, also in like the desert shrublands on the western slope. One thing I like to use this picture for is just to appreciate like the height of the vegetation. In both the low country and the high country, the vegetation is really low. And even though we think of the high country as being snow covered, it's still a moisture deprived environment. It's super windy and the moisture that is there is frozen. And then once it starts to thaw, gravity takes over and that moisture moves into the forested mid elevation life zones. And then we get to the valley there where you see once again grasses predominate the landscape. So if you can learn one little thing, the height of the vegetation in Colorado is a great proximate value for how much moisture is available to the landscape. So I will ask you to do some drawing and writing if you really want to learn in this in this webinar. So take a moment to write down your definition of ecology. And if you are comfortable sharing it in the chat, we'd love to hear it there. All right, you're free to keep sharing. Here's my definition. So the study of how organisms interact with their environment, that's one way to think about it. And another one is the interaction between abiotic and biotic factors. The problem with this first one is like organisms are alive, but many things in the quote environment are also alive. And so this doesn't really separate between the living and non-living components that drive what we see in our landscapes in Colorado. So there's abiotic factors in the environment and biotic factors, with which both might be scaffolding components of the habitat or the animals in flora, fauna that are interacting with it. So inside the grasslands, there are lots of predictable abiotic factors. There are mild slopes typically, lots of solar radiation, and wild swings in temperature. And Colorado is probably one of the few places in America or the world where we could have like literally 100-degree change in temperature depending on what's going on with the wind and the sun and the time of year. We have very little rainfall, and this is kind of a quote from the grasslands. Of course, there's more precipitation in our mountain communities, and of course, there are also grasses, right? But we're not talking so much about grasses under forested canopies. Right now, we're just talking about the grassland life zone itself. Also, fire is an important part of grassland ecology, and our soils are slightly alkaline, and their texture can depend on the basement soils. So, as you move east and you're in a more depositional environment, there's medium to fine textured soils. But like here in Colorado Springs, rocks. We got rocks. Decomposed granite. So grasses, they have some specific characteristics. We like to call them monocots versus dicots, although there are flowers that are also monocots. And these words, monocot and dicot, just really refer to like what the plant looks like when it first germinates, whether it has one leaf or two. Grasses typically have a fibrous root system. So if we think back to the last slide and like, what are you going to do with infrequent moisture that's falling from the sky? Hopefully you have a tactic for absorbing it quickly. And that's why fibrous roots are advantageous in our grasses. Also in a grass heavy environment, like there's low lignin content, which should relate in your mind to the idea that like there's organic matter because it actually decomposes. Furthermore, the blades of grass plants decompose every year. So another dominant group of plants in Colorado are evergreens, but those leaves last 6 to 8 years and they don't decompose very quickly because of these recalcitrant lignin-like materials in their fibers. So grasses have the potential to really like develop decent soil and have significant organic matter within them. Grasses can be perennial or annual. Most of our natives are perennial, but we have annual grasses as well. And some of our terrible invasives are annual. And the reason why they are such a problem is because they're able to like take the niche early in the season before our warm season grasses have really even woken up from the winter. And so they're able to like rob the environment of resources before our natives are even really paying attention. So something to consider, their management of invasives can really be temporal if you understand the phenology and behaviors of these plants. So here are just a bunch of forbs. I want to emphasize that there are many forbs in the grasslands, and they're super important to our habitat functions in the ecosystem services that the grassland provides. But in this talk today, I won't be talking about the forbs. I'll be talking about the annuals, or excuse me, about the grasses. So thinking about the biotic factors, including the animals, grazing is an important part of the grassland environment. So in other words, when we consume grass parts, we encourage growth, right? But this is all to a very limited extent. So I am not a rangeland specialist, although I've studied that a fair amount. We can think about how there's like this intermediate disturbance that's required in the grassland. It's great to have some disturbance to encourage growth. And the climax community is not like the preferred achieved state, but rather a dynamic state. That's one with the most diversity. And so historically, we've had bison. And I think the key difference between bison and cows is how long they stay on the range, right? Bison were ranging wide and far. And although they might have a like hard consumptive in presence on a grassland, that would really happen very rarely. And so now with our cows in their confined spaces, we see what we see on the right side of the slide here, which is that, if 90% of the plant is consumed, basically the plant stops growing. And for all of you gardeners out there, I want to make another analogy. Like, why do you have to be careful when you transplant plants? You have to be careful because if you sever any root parts, for example, it takes time for the plant to grow new roots with apical meristems, so with parts that can grow. But if you rip the tips off all the roots, they can't grow anymore, so they have to grow new roots, right? So it's kind of a similar like setback when we think about grazing. Hold on, I noticed there's a bunch of chat comments, so hold on one second. Oh, these are more definitions. Thank you so much. All right. Yeah, so John Pape, thinking about prairie dogs, I think that has to do with population dynamics, in an area where there are prairie dogs, their range is likewise severely limited, right? We have bison in Genesee, but they're not ranging across the Great Plains, right? So same thing with the prairie dogs. They can be extremely um, detrimental, but that analogy fits for them as well. We have lots of small mammals, and I think it's important to stop here and appreciate that what's good for a small mammal is also good for pollinators. And so when we're again not going to talk about grass or woody stems today, we're not going to talk about like the importance of our native shrubs, but they really provide so much habitat and forage for our small mammals and for our invertebrates and for us because most woody shrubs are edible. But in the context of the grassland, small mammals just really help with that carbon cycling that we were talking about before and insect control. All right. So other things we rarely think about, but there are many biotic factors that we don't see, right? For example, there's a whole kingdom of organisms that live in the soil that we never think about. And their facultative partnership with soil or with plant roots is to extend them, right? When I talk to my students about chemistry, I talk about physics, right? All chemistry requires proximity. Proximity is a principle of physics, right? So if you think about a soil or a root in the soil, it's more proximate to moisture and nutrients if it has more surface area. And so the partnership with fungi helps to facilitate that. And I know there are people here in this meeting who could talk about this particular topic forever. So please consider giving a program about it at some point in the future, but I will just leave it at this. Appreciate these diagrams. Fungal relationships expand the surface area of plant roots, which increases their absorptive capacities. Oh, I don't know what this story is about. I didn't click on this, so let's just skip this. You can read it later when you visit the slides. So as we wrap up this ecological part of the talk, There are many threats to our grasslands that mostly arrive from anthropogenic means, and those are humans and their trappings. So I like to tell people that, I married into the Gaddis family. There are dozens of Gaddises in northern Colorado. The Wade Gaddis water treatment facility in Longmont is named after my husband's grandfather, who really had a vision a long time ago. And that vision was to not sell the water. And so Longmont never sold any water rights at the beginning of civilization in northern Colorado. And as a result, we see so much growth and expansion in that area. But this is my family farm, right? And so I will tell you, like, not my education, but the education of my husband was funded by these things right here in the middle of the grassland. And these are fracking wells. So my family was historically dairy farmers from Kansas. They moved to Colorado. They found oil on their farm, right? So what you see around the fracking wells is alfalfa. And over to the right, there's a big reservoir. Those are all my little cousins. There's an aging cottonwood. And this is kind of what we see in the landscape in northern Colorado. And actually, there's very few native plants in this landscape. And so we need to just consider how we can make that happen in our small acreage or home landscapes, because our landscapes are at work. Uh, I think what I'm showing with this picture here is grazing, right? So we have always used our lands, our American Western lands are working, right? They're not in conservation by and large. So in the foreground, you see here, there's like this little low fence, and then in the back, I think that's just like electrical poles. But I took this picture while driving because, you can see how much longer the grass is in the CDOT landscape along the road byway as compared to the landscape within, the grazing allotment. And so going back to that early diagram I was showing, um, maybe one benefit of roads is that we've cordoned off a certain corridor that is allowed to rest in our working Western lands. And there are these roads that I was just speaking of. This is in slide up. All right. Also, of course, some of our human impacts are related to our love of nature, right? So recreation has great impacts. And this is why a movement like Leave No Trace is really important for us to consider, because staying the trail is a really important part of your everyday land ethic. Here's an interesting one. If anyone knows what this is, please write in the chat. I think I first saw this from an airplane. And then during COVID, we started driving around and I learned so much. So this is the solar thermal generation facility south of Las Vegas. So a lot of our American Western landscapes are being utilized for solar power regeneration. And it's great to think about this as a renewable energy, but the reality is it happens on the landscape, right? What you're seeing here in the Great Tortoise Country, the ground does not have a lake on it. Those are all solar panels, and they're all being directed towards this thermal capture tower. And if you can imagine, it is extremely hot and very bright right here. And so novel use of our American public lands, something to think about when we're considering the health of our landscapes. Yes, John, solar energy. Thank you. All right. other fun things is land conversion. So another trip, COVID, Arizona, made my husband stop the car. I was like, that's cotton. And I was like, what is cotton doing growing in Arizona? Well, a couple days later, after a bunch of research, I learned that the best cotton is grown in our deserts and not in humid areas. And this is cotton grown on Colorado River water. So, some interesting land conversion questions at hand. Of course, also we have a lot of non-native species and invasive species. We brought them here, right? I like to remind people to please have a level of compassion because our kochia and Canada thistle and cheatgrass, we brought this from the old world because the Homestead Act told us that we had to improve the land to be able to own it. And so what did we do? We took our old world seeds and we worked the land and tried to put it into actual agricultural use. But we find that plants that are from arid environments are pretty aggressive in our semi-arid landscape. And then finally, last slide of this part of the talk, we love to live here, right? And we love the good old Kentucky bluegrass. So another threat to our grasslands is us, our love of suburban expansion. And so with that, we will move on to our next topic. Are there any questions? What time is it? How are we doing? We're doing great. All right. So now let's take a look at some of these native plants. And there are some key tools that people use to explore the plants of Colorado. This is an old slide. This is first edition Flora of Colorado, but we're on the second edition now. So this text in the middle of the slide, that's pretty much the leading publication that you could be using in Colorado to identify plants. There are other national opportunities like USDA Plants Database, the BONAP, the Biota of North America. SciNet is another internet tool. But what we see on the left here is our historic text by Weber and Whitman. And until we started looking in microscopes, we really cataloged plants and handled their taxonomy based on morphology. How did they look? So I never really had a good way of explaining to people what the difference between Weber and Ackerfield are, but Weber is a morphological key, right? It's based on how the plants look. It is fun to look at, but it is kind of hard to work with in a professional context because so many of the names and the organizational schema have changed. So we now use Agrifield, which is based more on genetic research. And Jan Wingate has all these really great grass identification publications. They are really inexpensive. Jan works at the herbarium at Denver Botanic Gardens. And in preparation for this talk, I really compared, the Ackerfield keys from the Wingate keys. And the Wingate keys are based off of Harrington and Durrell, is that correct? And so you see some differences there, but they're sharing nomenclature. And you can get these books from the Conib's bookstore. Yes, Paul Shaw. I was talking about this the other day, and I really like Shaw. It's bigger than Colorado, right? But also I wondered about the like when was it last updated? How reflective is it of genetic advances? Do you know?
That's a good point. Yeah, I don't think it's been updated in a while. So that is a problem we have. that we learn a lot of new things and the taxonomy changes. That's always going to be a problem with any of these books.
Yeah. So you'll see what I've tried to do is kind of use Acrofield as a training tool, but digest it into like some informal science education. So let's think about the anatomy of a grass. And this is where you might want to just have a pen and paper and be sketching, right? Sketching diagrams like this is a great way to bring this memory into or bring these experiences into your long-term memory. So before we go any further, like any key about grasses is going to ask you all these questions about these parts that are hard to see. Parts that are underground, parts that are in the floret, which is just impossibly small. And so what I want you to think about is the uh, floret paradigm, right? Like these words that we encounter, they really have an order to them. And so if you look in the bottom left, right, there are these words called glooms. And what we think about is like the stem that would be right below. Can you see my cursor? It's like right over the way it's
Yes.
expanded. Okay, cool. So there'd be a pedicel right here between like expanded spikelet. And then the first two are going to be the outer and inner glooms. And then as we move out, we have we're looking up to the top left now. We have the lemma and the palea, and then the ovary is inside of there. So we've finally gotten into the floret itself. And I think one of the challenges in grass ID is understanding this, right? Where's the floret? There's a lot of things sticking out of the spikelet. But if you just get it in your mind that it always goes gloom, lemma, palea, ovary from bottom to top. Sometimes there's two glooms, sometimes there's one. That is a great way to start thinking about how do you understand your grasses. All right, so now let's look into the leaf in the center. So this is really important for grasses because no matter whether you can see the florets or not, you can always see the leaf. And so what you find in a grass is that the leaf is always like embracing the grass stem and it's like rolled around it. And sometimes it's open, sometimes it's fused, sometimes it's closed. So right here where it comes together at the collar, you want to be like studying that and taking pictures of it. And inside that sheath, which is where the like leaf stem wraps around, or the leaf wraps around the stem, you have this collar. It's called a ligule. And that collar is the thing I will focus on a lot in the very first identification here, where I'm not using the key yet. You can focus in on what that looks like and start to identify grasses. And so focus on that ligule. The blade itself in the key, it like references how wide it is, how long it is, the tip of it, whether the tip is blunt or pointed. Maybe sometimes it references coloration, but not often. I've mostly seen like coloration referenced in like terms of flowers and then POA in particular, because it characteristically is like has red and green. And then finally, when we look over to the roots, we have underground roots, which are called rhizomes. We have overground roots called stolons, and we have fibrous roots. So when we think about whether grass is rhizomatous or not, which means it grows like through these underground stems, that's something you can see, right? Based on the habit of the grass. Other grasses are bunch grasses, and so they are not connected and they're not expanding vegetatively. And so we go on. All right, so there's lots of different ways we think about what a grass spikelet might look like. But the spike is the seed head, and it might have one or more spikelets that are born from the main axis. And the raceme is the seed head in which the spikelets are born on individual stalks, so they're called pedicels. But sometimes the fruits are just right on the main axis, the rachis. And the panicle is a seed head with a main axis and subdivided branches. So I often think about this as the panicle is open, right? If the grass is open looking and there's lots of space and lots of little stems, like in the bottom right there, we're talking about a panicle. Further ado, we're going to just march through some of these common grasses. And hold on, there's one thing. Oh, Heidi says GLP is always helpful. Gloom lemopalea. So thank you for adding that. I appreciate it. All right. So in this first part, I'm not going to talk too heavily with botanical vocabulary. I'm just going to try to encourage you to appreciate the essence of the plant, right? And you can use your reactions if you know to say hello, thumbs up if you've seen this grass before. So here we have sand rice grass. I think this grass has gone through at least 3 name changes since I first learned of it. The first being Oreosopsis hymeneoides, then Achnotharum. This is an old name, and now it is Areacoma. So let me just fix that real quick. Hold on one sec. All right. And this grass, I think the most it's always growing in the most impossible places. And I've never really seen it in great abundance, but in the literature, it is noted as one of the staple grass species used by indigenous folks. So one thing you might be able to appreciate in this really tiny little picture is that if the seeds are showing, they're black, like they're these black balls and they are covered in white hairs. So that's really hard to miss. And then also the ligule here in the center picture, it's membranous, right? It's not hairy. And it comes to a point, it's really pointy compared to the rest of them. And the final thing is also like there are other grasses like sand dropsy that do this. But what you're going to notice here, if you can see it, is that the sheath is like rolling around the inflorescence and it seems as though it's fully developed before it actually emerges. Once it finally emerges and the panicle opens, like it's not still developing. It's already developed. Uh, and this, in my research, I would say my concluding comments about this is that it takes a long time to germinate. So if you are a research manager and you're thinking about your seed mixes and you have like a 3-year contract and you want to see the species you plant in those years, this isn't going to be one of them. This is going to be one that's not going to show up until your contract's probably over. And that's in my personal experience. And if I see anything you disagree with, please contradict me in the chat. All right. So big blue stem, Andropogon giardii. I'm a big fan of this one. It's called turkey foot. And so if you hold your fingers like this, the inflorescence has like spikelets and threes, these gorgeous yellow parts here in the middle. These are the flowers, right? Grasses have flowers, which is so lovely. And these maroon dots here, if we zoomed in, we would find that those are the stigma and they're like little pipe cleaners. And so grasses are gorgeous if you can take the time to look that closely. What we see in the far right is the blades, right? See how there is like this W in the collar, and there's no central stem here in this blade that I'm looking at, but you can kind of see how there's a color change right there at the collar. So that's the kind of important thing that you want to be looking at. And it looks hairy, right? It doesn't look membranous in the ligule. So if anything, just make sure you're taking pictures of that part of the plant so you can really study those vegetative characteristics. I think in my studies that big blue stem is a Great Plains species. If you really look at it in iNaturalist, it's not on the western slope. There are a few observations of it, but I assume those are in gardens. And so I find it interesting because I think of it now as a Great Plains species that likes to be right up on the foothills at the transition because it is a tall grass. And so in the foothills, we see that change of slope from a steeper mountainous slope to a lower grade grassland slope. And there's actually a lot of moisture right there. And our biggest floral organisms in Colorado are in the foothills to Montane, and those are ponderosa pines. And ponderosa pines are there because that's where the most moisture is. Now we have purple threon, Aristida purpurea, and this is an interesting grass that seems to have some salt tolerant qualities. It's very low growing, but if you are out in the early mornings, I find it really easy to identify because it catches so much dew. It often looks like this white haze of dew if you're looking in a meadow. But as you can see in this reflection on this piece of paper in the middle picture, we have three awns, and we didn't really discuss the awns, but they're usually arising from the lemma or the palea. And what we're going to find here is at the end of each floret, there are three long awns, which are just these long hair-like appendages. And if you can think about how grasses are wind dispersed, this is a great mechanism for wind dispersal. Some grasses senesce to really beautiful red and yellow colors, but this one pretty much goes white out. So another way to think about it. But the easiest way to identify it is just to delicately pull on one of those awns. And if you have three awns there and they're really long, you're looking at the purple three awn. So here we have Sidodes grama, Bouteloua curtipendula, another really gorgeous one. This did really well in my revegetation research. And here what we're going to see is that these florets are called pendulous. And so as you look on the left, you can see that there is a little pedicel, but it's really short, right? It's not totally an open panicle. And this picture on the left isn't doing it quite enough justice, but in the middle it sort of is. All of them are hanging off to one side. And so that's why it's called Sidodes grama. And I don't have a really great ligule picture here, but I'm fairly certain that this has a hairy ligule. So another good character to keep in mind. And this senesces to a really beautiful red color. So now we have the Colorado state grass, Bouteloua gracilis, and I love this guy. It's really neat to talk about. And the Kurama key is pretty easy to work through because you can really see the parts that they're discussing. And so here we have a one-sided spike, again, like we saw in the other Bouteloua. In the center here, these greenish appendages are the petals. So the petals are typically greenish, maybe a little yellowy. And also in here, see how there's so much hair? There's a lot of hair. And when you get into looking the difference between black grama, hairy grama, blue grama, it's really going to be talking to you about what that looks like in the hairs. And then I will also note, so remember one of the words we learned was rachis. And so as my cursor in this blue picture follows the stem, you see how it stops. The florets extend beyond it. But in hairy grama, we find that the rachis extends beyond the florets, and that is super noticeable. It's like a finger just sticking out from the end of it. Now, over on the far right, we can see that ligule and the collar, and we see that it is hairy, and there is also a color change there. And over on the far left, we can see that this sheath, right, is also kind of hairy. And so something to consider. Now in blue grandma, there are two spikes per stem. So that's another thing that you can look at. And when you're thinking about seed collection, it's really easy to tell if this is near dispersal because all you have left is like these veins. The actual florets have fallen out. So if it looks like sparse eyelashes, the seeds are gone. If it's robust, the seeds are still there. And as you can see in this center left picture, as it dries, they curl and they look like eyelashes. And that is why it is called eyelash grass. Caitlin, I would love to talk to you more about the various grandmas. I did a pretty serious study of that when we were in Comanche because there was blue, black, and hairy all in the same landscape. But I don't have those slides in this show, so I will have to get back to you on that. The blue grandma, which is our Colorado state grass, in codominance in the Great Plains, we find buffalo grass. And I think this one just name changed too. This is Bouteloua dactyloides now. So let me just fix this, which makes a lot of sense because it really looks exactly like Bouteloua. Different though in the key, we're gonna get there later, but it has these bulblets. But the actual inflorescence looks similar, but it is a dioecious plant, right? There's boy parts and girl parts. And so these two inflorescences represent those gender types. Also in the buffalo grass, I find, which you can see mostly in the left picture, is like the leaves are kind of like weak. They're not really robust, but look at how hairy they are. And I consider this density of hairs, I like to call it like a prepubescent beard, right? It's a young man going through puberty. It's about as much hair as he might have on his chinny chin chin. And we also have the hairy ligules on the buffalo grass as well. Also, the flower color is different, right? In the Bouteloua grassless, we had yellow flowers, but here we have red. This is a non-native species, but one I'm sure you're very familiar with. Our grasslands are threatened largely by different species of bromus. Interestingly, though, Bromus inermis smooth brome is a rhizome, and cheatgrass, Bromus tectorium, that's an annual, right? So how you would manage these two bromus species are completely different. But it's really easy to know if you have Bromus inermis. Most noticeably and famously, if you look at several leaf stems, you're going to see that there's like this McDonald's M. It's like an imprint in the middle of the leaf. And then you can study here in the ligule, we have color change, we have a membranous ligule, and the color itself kind of goes to a yellowish color while the rest is still green. Also, when this plant senesces, it senesces to like a purpley gray color, and the leaves kind of curl. And I find that to be something I can see like from a moving vehicle, whereas our native grasses tend to senesce to like brighter colors, like reds and yellows. Here in the left, we see that the Bromus inermis has yellow flowers, and also the general stature of this grass is more robust than most of our native grasses, with some exceptions, like the big blue stem would be even bigger than Bromus inermis, as would like switchgrass if it had enough, or Indian grass if it had enough moisture. Hesper stipicomata. Oh, someone might correct me. I think this guy changed name. There were so many name changes from second edition. And so needle and thread grass is another one of these taller grasses. But as we were talking about the awn before, this has exceptionally long awns and they kind of twist, which is called geniculate. The tip of the floret is really pokey, pretty easy to spot. Here we see that we have a membranous ligule, and it's kind of coming to a point. And this angulation of the leaf right at the collar, I find that to be really indicative. See how it just kind of bends away gently, and the ligule is still here, like extending towards the stem. That is a key characteristic of the needle and thread. And I find this to be pretty difficult to identify when there are no seeds, but usually if I'm spotting it, I can find at least one specimen with seeds still on it to make my comment. So here we have little blue stem. This is one of my faves. Little blue stem has the most beautiful seeds. They're so hairy, and again, in the morning light, it just looks so gorgeous with dew on it. And this plant in the center photo, this is kind of not doing it justice, but this is really late season. But it's like senesces to this beautiful red color. And I also don't have a picture of this right now, but if people ever watched Fraggle Rock when they were kids, these were these little creatures that lived underground. And at the end of their heads, they had like tentacle things that ended in what looked like a little suction cup. And if you look directly down into a little blue stem specimen, you'll see that where the seeds have departed, it looks like a little circle. It's like a little suction cup, or like the top of a Fraggle, a Fraggle's head. So, little blue stem. This is a great mid-season grass for any horticulturalists out here. Like, this should be in every garden. Die to the Carl Forster grass, and yay to the little blue stem. And the little blue stem is also exhibiting my prepubescent beard here. Really long, but very sparse hairs throughout the leaves and the whole structure. Sand dropseed, which I mentioned a long time ago when we were talking about the sand rice grass. And remember, I was talking about how the sheath of the leaf, it really like wraps around, and then when the inflorescence, which is an open panicle, emerges, it is like fully formed, right? It seems like it's fully wrapped up. And another key, I'm pretty sure this is actually noted in the key, but see how this leaf here that extends beyond the inflorescence, it's pretty short and it's really pointy. So I'm fairly certain that's something that they point to in the key. And we have a color change at the ligule, and we also see that it is very hairy. And so make sure you're taking pictures of those ligules and collars, because as far as being on a landscape you visit often, these are characteristics you can see at all times. So we have squirrel tail, which is non-native, and this plant has really long awns as well. And it is kind of like a closed spike, right? It's not an open panicle. And I don't have anything super important to say about this guy, except I think that this is noxious to horses. And I probably should have the squirrel tail, and there's foxtail barley, which is kind of a look-alike, but I don't think I have it in here. So this is intermediate wheatgrass. This is also non-native. So let me just note that here. So Thinopyrum intermedium, all the wheatgrasses, you can kind of get their joie de vivre if you hold your hands up like this. And so if it's crested wheatgrass, it's gonna be like these really rigid V's created by the florets. If it is slender wheatgrass, which is native, they're kind of oppressed like this to the stem, and they're alternating, right? So it's like they're bending around the stem. So you got this, and the crested is non-native, slender is native. But in the intermediate, you have something between this and this, right? The hands are alternating, but they're still kind of sticking out. And yeah, interesting subject, because if you're familiar with the work of the Land Institute in Kansas, they're working to modify this grass in hopes that it will be the first perennial grain crop used in like mass agriculture. So kind of an interesting story to follow. In the bottom left, I'll just note here the ligule. This is one we haven't seen yet, where it's like wrapping and the two sides don't come in at the same height. One's above the other. And so that's something to note with this grass. I think we got through all of the plants that I thought I would share with you tonight. You can study this more. I'm going to skip a bunch of slides, but I really work to teach people about using the key and using a process of elimination. So I wanted to spend my last time sharing that vision with you. And also I'm going to go through all of these first couplets in the Poaceae key because it's really not that hard to get through the first page of the Poaceae key because it's all a process of elimination. And so if later you want to explore this, I've keyed out to Bootaloo or Grassless with these little post-it notes. So without further ado, this is the last part, which I just added. And so I would love your feedback. But let's go travel through the first several couplets in Poaceae in second edition Ackerfield. If you have one, it starts on page 632. And as I noted, it's a process of elimination. So it's really not that hard to get to the family key. So the first thing you're asked about is if there are spikelets enclosed in burrs or not. And so a dichotomous key is based on, it's a couplet. It's like, is it this or that? And then you go to the next number, this or that, next number. But if you join us in the restoration committee, we have trained people to find the seeds that the plants we need to collect seeds from by using the key backwards, right? So you go to the specimen you need to know about, and then you go backwards. You figure out what you would have had to choose to get to that particular species. But here we're just going to go forward and look at how you get through the first couplets of Poaceae. So spikelets enclosed in burrs, spikelets not enclosed in burrs. So I didn't really show you any burr species today except for the buffalo grass. And so we're gonna just skip over that. And so we're gonna go to 3. Although I will say at 2B, burrs are not spiny, plants strongly stoloniferous, dioecious, that's Buchloe or the Bootalua, the buffalo grass. All right, so now we're going to go to 3, and it's this or that. Inflorescence unisexual, the female spike with numerous spikelets in 8 to 24 rows, which we call ears, with each spike surrounding by several leaf sheaths and husks, the male spikelets in panicles called tassels. And this is corn. So we didn't look at corn today, and we all know what corn looks like. So we're not talking about that. So let's go to number 4. So then we get to number 4, and 4A lands in a 2-species genus Monroa, which I think is now called Dasyacloa, but I was confused as to why iNaturalists would call it Dasyacloa, but we're still on Monroa in Ackerfield. So anyone has any ideas about that. That was news to me today. So capitate clusters, subsessile in fascicles of leaves at each branch tip, which you can see in both of these specimens here, the squarosa and the pucella. This would be easy to count out, right? Be like, it's not that. All right, so we move on to 4B, spikelets not in capitate clusters, go to 5, okay? We come to a couplet that ends in only one genus and species. So if it's not this, we can move on, right? So glooms are absent, which we can sort of appreciate here, right? There's no this and that and this and that. It just goes right to the floret. And so no glooms, lemma, blah, blah, blah. Blades with strongly scabrous margins. This is an excellent picture of that, right? There's that really razor edge of hairs on the edge of the leaves. The spikelets are flat, so you can kind of appreciate that in these pictures. But I would say I'm not familiar with this plant too much. Looks like the florets are flat, not necessarily the whole spikelets to me. We can also see that it's one flowered, right? From each pedicel, there just appears to be one floret. And the lemmas are stiffly hispid ciliate, which you can see right here, right? Hispid and ciliate, these are words that describe hairs, and you can see that clearly. And you can also see that there are no awnds, right? So we get Teliarcia oryzoides, which we're looking at right now, and it's not that. So now we're at 6. 6A, florets forming mostly bulblets with shiny dark purple bases and exerted linear green tips. Poa bulbosa, non-native. Okay. Again, this is one that if you saw it, you'd be like, what the heck is this? And it's not any poa you've ever seen before. So moving right along. Now you're at the keys. Let's get a little golf clap. That was fast, right? Who knew we could move through so many questions at the same moment? So now there's key 1 through 5 and key A and B. And I'm going to end it right here. I just think that if we look at these different collections of possible genera per key, we'll get to that process of elimination. So if the spikelets are in pairs, right, these are our opportunities for genera. In key 2, we have lots of them. Inflorescence branching bearing spikelets all on one side of the rachis, right? But when I look through all this genera, like when we're doing work for example, the Rocky Mountain Native Plant Materials Program, there's only a couple genera here that we work with, right? Bouteloua, and Muhlenbergia in this particular list. Key 3, spikelets are sessile, arranged in two-sided spikes or spike-like racemes. And here, like, I personally am only familiar, again, with a few of the genera, and they include Agropyron, Hordeum, Elamis, Limus, Pascopyrum, Thinopyrum, and Pseudorogionaria. Those are plants that I feel like are pretty common that you might explore. Key 4, spikelets with one developed floret. Here we've got Aristida, which we looked at, Purpurea, purple 3 on. We have Panicum virgatum, which we didn't actually look at, which was switchgrass. Hesperostipa comata, Oryzopsis, which I think it still exists, but the sand rice grass isn't in there anymore. It's in the Areocoma, Muhlenbergia, Calamagrostis. So that's the Karl Forster grass, but we do have native versions of Calamagrostis, and I found one on Pikes Peak in the Alpine, Calamagrostis purpurans. It was very beautiful. And yeah, Spirobolus is another one that I'm familiar with. Key 5, Danthonia, Muhlenbergia again. We get the Monroa that we talked about before. Key A, spikelets with 2 or more florets. Lemmas are on. Here you might be familiar with Deschampsia, Bromus, Festuca, Muhlenbergia. And key B, I must say, I ran out of time, and I will finish this before I give you the slides. Without further ado, I'm going to stop. Thank you. Please let me know if you have questions. We still have about 10 minutes.